Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to our second webinar with the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment about the Building for Climate Change proposals. So since our last webinar, the Ministry has launched the public consultation on 2 frameworks. So today is a great chance to hear more about those, the process from here, and also to ask any questions you may have to help inform and shape your own submission on it. So my name is Tom Furley. I'm part of the communications team here at the New Zealand Green Building Council. Today's discussion and the chance we have now to shape how our legislation helps embed climate action in our sector comes at an important time. Hopefully, all of you tuning in will be aware that this week marks World Green Building Week. World Green Building Week is a chance for our community around the globe to join together to drive better, sustainable, greener buildings and action on climate change. So a warm welcome to everyone tuning in. Welcome to our members, and for all of those of you who are not members or are not familiar with the New Zealand Green Building Council, we're a not-for-profit established by the construction and property sectors, and we have a vision for all homes and buildings in Aotearoa to be green and sustainable, making healthier, happier New Zealanders. We have already had 2 successful webinars for World Green Building Week this week, including one earlier today actually, and we've got a great lineup of thought-provoking discussions through to mid next week. These are made possible thanks to our national sponsors Temper Zone and Rubik's, and our webinar sponsors Resine, Auckland Conversations and Jib. So a huge thank you to you for all your support. Today we're joined by MB Principal Advisor in the Systems Strategy and Performance team, Elrond Burrell, and Katie Symons, Principal Advisor in the Building Performance and Engineering team. So thank you both for joining us this afternoon. I'll hand over to you shortly, but before I do, I just wanted to highlight for all of you tuning in that we will have time for your questions after the presentation. So make sure you get those in through the presentation, through the Q&A section. Should just be down there at the bottom of your screen. So make sure to get through any questions as they come to mind, and hopefully we can get through them all later in the webinar. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Elrond and Katie.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, and yeah, hello everyone. Really excited to be here during World Green Building Week. It's a brilliant opportunity. So yeah, thanks very much to everyone for taking time out of your day to listen to us. Come to talk about the Building for Climate Change programme. If you just pop back at, oh, you're just sorting the slides there, Tom. Thanks. Yeah, so my name is Katie Symons. I'm a Principal Advisor in Engineering in the Building Performance and Engineering team of Building System Performance. So I've been leading the work on the Embodied Carbon Framework, or Whole of Life Embodied Carbon Framework. Elrond, do you want to introduce yourself now?
Sure. So, tēnā koutou katoa, and thank you for the opportunity. Like Katie said, it's really good to be able to have a short presentation, then questions and answers about the framework so people can really understand and come back to us. We're really hoping to get good in-depth engagement from the industry about the proposals. They are proposals, so we're really looking forward to seeing what people have got to say about them and looking at how we can refine them, or if there's things we've got wrong to correct those, or if there's things we've missed so we can add that in. So we really want to see this develop into really robust frameworks that lead the way as we go forward with the how we address climate change in the built environment or the building sector in New Zealand.
Thanks. So Tom's kindly driving our slides today. We had a few technical issues with our computer at our end. So the next one. So just a brief update on the immediate timeframes, and as Elrond said, the frameworks, the 2 frameworks that we'll talk about today, they are currently out for public consultation. They were released the end of last month. originally only for a month consultation, but we've had a pretty overwhelming response actually, so that's great to see, and feedback that more time would be appreciated to consolidate and really give proper thought to the questions that are posed in these frameworks. So we've extended that now until the 11th of October. So please pass the word round that if people heard about this initially, they've got a little bit longer to get their comments on the frameworks through. All right, sorry, we just need to do something, I think.
No, I think that's.
Oh no,
I think that's for Tom to control L for the screen. Thanks.
So yeah, so when we get the oh sorry, just a quick rundown on the rest of those timeframes. So the next steps will be once the consultation is closed on those frameworks, we'll be considering the feedback pretty carefully, and then releasing a summary of the submissions that we've received and summary of the next steps. And then ongoing from that, there'll be future consultations as we get sort of more into the detail. But what we're going to talk about today on the agenda, so a quick overview of the Boon for Climate Change programme, and some of you might have dialed into the presentation I gave with another of my colleagues, Christian, a few weeks ago, but if you weren't able to hear that, we'll go over that again. An overview of the consultations, details on the two frameworks that are addressing climate change mitigation, their emissions reductions, and then there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. Thanks. So the next slide. So the problem that I think we're all aware of is New Zealand has a tough road ahead if it's to reach its goal of being net carbon zero by 2050, as was set out in legislation by the passing of the Zero Carbon Act at the end of last year. So the building and construction sector, like all sectors of New Zealand society and the New Zealand economy, has got a major part to play in this, and we've got to make some pretty big changes. So the Building for Climate Change programme is set up to address that. As part of the government response to meeting the goal of being net zero carbon by 2050, obviously the Climate Change Act resulted in the formulation of the Climate Change Commission, which is setting out carbon budgets leading up to that zero by 2050 target. And in response to that, there's a whole of government programme to meet those carbon budgets in what's being known as the emissions reduction plan. And that emissions reduction plan is broken down into 5 sectors or 5 key areas, building and construction being one. The others, if I can remember, are waste, agriculture, primary industries, industrial, heat and power, transport, and
so anyone I can remember.
there's another one that'll come to me. But anyway, building and construction is one of the 5, and we in the Building Systems Performance Branch, we are the Building for Climate Change programme will be the input into that part of the emissions reduction plan. So we're part of a wider all of government programme. Because we all know the building and construction sector is a large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, both from energy used in buildings and the energy and emissions produced by making construction materials and products, and the whole process of constructing buildings, demolishing their end of life throughout the whole building life cycle. So on the next slide, so to transform the building and construction sector, we've got 2 goals. Reducing emissions, so that's our contribution to the National Emissions Reduction Plan and the overall goal of being net zero by 2050, but also improving resilience of our buildings and built environment to the risks that that we all face from the changes to the climate that are already, we know are already going to happen because of the effects of greater concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So the whole Building for Climate Change programme does address both of these both of these challenges, but today we're going to be talking about the two frameworks that are looking at the first one here, reducing emissions. And as we said, that's reducing the two types of emissions commonly, how we commonly break down emissions in the building sector is from emissions from operating buildings and the emissions from making, creating, constructing buildings themselves. So the next slide. So as I say, we've got these two frameworks that we've published now, really to start the conversation on how we can tackle the problem of reducing emissions in the building and construction sector. So it really is a start of the conversation. There might be, we're anticipating we might get some feedback that perhaps isn't as much detail in there as people would like to see, but the reason for that is that we really want to make this a co-design process and bring the sector along with us to help us inform what is achievable and the ways that in which we can support the sector to meet these goals. So the first framework on operational efficiency of buildings, how we can do things like use less energy and water, but also maintain and improve indoor air quality and temperature, the indoor environment. And then the second framework is about reducing emissions generated across the life cycle of a building by the production, maintenance, demolition of the buildings themselves. So the materials and the products that go into making that building. And that's what's known as the whole of life embodied carbon. So that's the headlines of the two frameworks, and within those two framework documents there are a group of initiatives that, or proposals really, that sit under each framework that we feel is needed to support the changes, and that's what we want to discuss with you today and get feedback on through the process. So on the next slide I'll hand over to Elrond, who will talk about the first framework.
Thanks, Katie. So the first framework has already been talked about is the one for transforming operational efficiency. And although this is primarily focused on reducing operational emissions, it actually has three high-level objectives which do step slightly outside of just the mitigation side of climate change. So first off, there's reducing operational emissions, which is important for mitigation and an important part of the building and construction sector's contribution to the National Emissions Reduction Plan, as Katie was talking about earlier. And the carbon emissions from the operation of buildings comes directly from burning fossil fuels and indirectly from using electricity and using water in buildings. And so by increasing operational efficiency and reducing these components, then we're reducing the operational emissions. As it's titled, Transforming Operational Efficiency, you'll see we're not talking about just an incremental step up from what the building code requires for these aspects at the moment, but really having a very broad look at how we can achieve the broader and bigger outcomes that we're trying to with the objectives of this framework. The second one, reducing water use, is, although it relates to operational emissions, it's also really important for climate change adaptation and resilience. And as particularly people up in Auckland will be well aware, there's regions in New Zealand that are already suffering from low availability of water, and so we need to look at how we can use efficiency and how much water we use in buildings to try and assist keeping water available and making sure we're not using what our fair share of it is. And then the third part of it is improving health and well-being. It's like we're really conscious that we don't want to just ramp up energy efficiency of buildings and do it at a cost of what the indoor environmental qualities of buildings are as well. We're also conscious that currently the buildings as they're regulated in New Zealand are not necessarily delivering the best health and well-being outcomes as they could be. And so this is an opportunity to really look at that and see if we can get everything lined up to do a much better job on that side of things as well. So good outcomes for health and well-being as well as for climate outcomes. And that includes comfortable temperatures, not too cool in winter, but also not overheating in summer. We're conscious about the warming climate, and also moisture issues and ventilation, air quality, etc. If we can just jump onto the next slide, please, Tom. So when we kind of look at what the current state of the industry in New Zealand is, if we consider how buildings are currently designed and built in New Zealand, operational efficiency and high efficiency buildings is quite a specialist area within the building and construction sector. Typically, it's not kind of part of the mainstream education of architects and designers and engineers and builders. those that are interested in it kind of pursue it outside their mainstream education and undertake specialist training for that if that's what they're interested in. We're also quite conscious that the way operational efficiency is currently regulated within the building code is not as robust as it could be, and perhaps not suitable for what we're facing with climate change and where we need to get to with the Zero Carbon Act. And at the same time, it doesn't have the strong link between the energy efficiency side of things and the health and well-being side, like I was talking about previously. And the way things are approached at the moment is quite fragmented. Lots of different aspects of compliance that you have to work with that don't necessarily all tie together very well in terms of an overall approach to operational efficiency and health and well-being. At the same time, we're aware that there are parts of the sector which are responding to this, and obviously NZGBC members and those that are pursuing green ratings and other voluntary standards in New Zealand, like Passive House and Living Building Challenge and things, are part of a growing sector that's very aware of these issues of operational efficiency and occupant comfort and well-being. And so this is kind of part of the sector which has been growing, but still fairly niche in terms of where the overall sector's at. So we are seeing more high-performance buildings starting to come out, but not enough yet for meeting our goals. So for our vision for 2035 is that we really want all of New Zealand's new buildings that are being built using as little energy and water as possible, while also being warmer and drier, better ventilated, better indoor environmental qualities for people. And through this, we want to improve the overall well-being of New Zealanders. And at the same time, they should be able to spend less money on the energy bills while they're using the buildings also. And we want the building and construction sector to be confident and successful in designing and constructing energy efficient and water efficient buildings with low operational carbon emissions, so that these are core parts of how we design and construct buildings in New Zealand rather than something that's a little bit niche, a little bit extra. And so we're going to be regulating for an emissions cap, so that would be something that would be integrated in the way people work in the industry by 2035. And that these changes should result in a significant reduction in the carbon emissions from building operations and make an important contribution to our emissions reduction plan and meeting net zero by 2050. We've set the operational efficiency for 2035 because we think that it's something that there's quite good awareness and understanding of what is possible in the industry already. And it's something we can go a little bit faster on than some other measures around climate change. And so it's something we can drive through a bit quicker and achieve earlier success on this and maybe on the embodied carbon stuff that Kate will talk about, or in other sectors like transport and agriculture, where they've got considerable challenges around decarbonisation, some of their aspects. If we can go on to the next slide, please, Tom. So the approach we're taking for transforming operational efficiency is essentially summed up in a series of mandatory operational caps. So an overall operational emissions cap, which then is broken up in a series of sections below that make up the overall emissions cap. The idea is that we will be publishing what the requirements for the caps are once this comes through as regulations. So right from the very beginning, everyone will know what the future settings for this are going to be and where we need to get to by 2035. So people can prepare and the leaders in the industry can get ahead and start building what we'll be requiring by then earlier. And that we can see innovation and products and design and construction professionals ready for that much earlier than the end kind of state of it. So set really clear signals from early on so that we know where we're heading and how to get there. It also means we have an opportunity as a regulator to monitor how the progress is going and what buildings are performing like as we're going through the various steps of this. And if need be, we can reset or we can learn or we can provide further support to the industry through those series of steps so that when we get to 2035, it's altogether successful. We're really conscious that we want to have a measurable impact and not just have good intentions that don't necessarily deliver on what the purpose of the whole framework is. Another aspect of it is that we are already and we will continue to be working with other public sector bodies that have portfolios of buildings and looking to them to lead out ahead of the private sector, so that parts of the government will be adopting future caps earlier than what is required by the regulations. And throughout that whole process, we'll be working closely with the industry and looking, like I said, with the feedback loop of the different steps as to how we can provide support and what aspects of, whether it's educational tools or other things, are necessary to help bring each step into being. We can go to the next slide, please. So the operational emissions cap is essentially made up of 3 different parts of it. So we address fossil fuel combustion directly, because that is where we have direct emissions from buildings from. And if you look in the framework, you'll see there's a proposed series of steps down from what a reasonable amount of fossil fuel use is, down to 0 by 2035. And then we have electricity use, which is all the kind of other power use in buildings. And that within that, we have the thermal demand. And then we have the services efficiency, so make up essentially all the other electricity uses in buildings. And then we put some considerations to how plug loads or unregulated loads are used within buildings. And at the moment, the proposal is that for small buildings, so buildings that are under 300 square meters and under 3 stories, wouldn't have regulated caps for the plug loads, but there would be default values used in the way that it's regulated, whereas larger buildings would have to have a bit more detail about how they're meeting the requirements for that. We're also proposing that on-site renewable generation storage is not something that would be requiring. Obviously, it may be useful in certain projects and certain situations to meet the other requirements of the framework, but it's not something that would be required on every building. And then a water use cap also, which is related both to the emission side of it, but also the resilience about the volume of water being used in buildings. If we can jump on to the next slide, please. So just a couple other points about it in terms of the scope of this. So at the moment, the scope applies to almost all the different building classifications in the building code. There's a couple of exceptions for ancillary buildings and outbuildings, because they're not normally occupied buildings, so wouldn't normally be using energy for keeping people warm or healthy within them. But even so, within there's some consideration about certain types of buildings that would be considered an ancillary building but may well have energy use that we need to be looking at regulating in terms of operational efficiency. The scope is limited to new buildings at this stage, and I know lots of people that have already been feeding back to us have been saying we really need to do something about existing buildings. And a lot of us here in MBIE are also very concerned and interested about how we address existing buildings and the operational emissions coming from those. At this point in time, it's not within this framework, and we're looking at other ways and how we can approach that. But by all means, let us have your views on that. The important thing is, though, that every new building that's getting built, we want to be meeting the most up-to-date requirements as possible, so that we don't then have to start retrofitting new buildings in 5 or 10 years' time as well. We want them to be right up to date, and they're an opportunity because they haven't been built yet, so we want to make sure that when they do get built, they're done properly. The other thing we're not looking at regulating within this framework is occupant behaviour. So we're talking about how a building is designed and how it's consented and how it's built, not about how much water or light people use or how much electricity they use in their day-to-day activities. There may be other work that we do as part of the framework, part of the program, but not this particular framework, which encourages people's behaviour to change towards positive things in terms of lower operational emissions. But this is not about telling people about how they should behave and use buildings per se. It's more about how we design and construct them. And that really sums up the operational efficiency framework. So we'll just keep moving quickly. So we've got time for questions.
Thanks, Elrond. So yeah, just I'll talk through the details of the second framework, which is snappily titled Reducing Whole of Life Embodied Carbon Emissions. The NZGBC audience is probably aware of what embodied carbon is, but the term whole of life embodied carbon means that we're trying to capture embodied carbon emissions from the materials and products that make up a building right across the whole life of the building, and indeed the supply chain of those products. So right from the initial production of the products, how the products were made, right through to them being used in the building, and then at the end of the building's life, when that building gets demolished, any emissions associated with disposing of those materials, or indeed benefits from recycling them. So the objectives of this framework, we've broken down embodied carbon kind of in a similar way to how people who calculate embodied carbon now, how you do it. So first of all, you look at how much you're actually building, how many square meters of new building are we constructing, and what we really want, this leads to the first objective, which is to really make sure that we're maximising the efficiency of our new building, ensuring that the size and quantity of new buildings that we build today are proportional to the need. And if there are other alternatives such as upgrading existing buildings so they can be used effectively, that they're looked at, but also making sure that every building we build now is maybe looking at increasing the longevity of those buildings, so they can be used effectively for years to come. Their components can be recycled, and we can really avoid emissions in the future from building in their resilience and longevity at the start of our new buildings. The second objective is, once we've decided to build a new building, is really making sure that we're using only as much material as is required to construct that size of a new building. So really making sure that we're making efficient use of materials. So that means includes reducing waste associated with the materials and products in buildings, but it's about making sure that the performance settings we're using for building design, we're not building in lots of contingencies, we're not over-engineering our buildings, but they are adequate for the purpose and use over the lifetime of the building. And then the third objective is, once we've got our size of building and we've minimized the amount of material that's going into that building, is making sure that for those materials we're doing as much as we can to reduce the carbon intensity, so the emissions associated with the production and the use of those materials and products over the whole life of the building. And we can do that in two ways. We can use design choices so that we're using low carbon alternatives over perhaps more traditional carbon intensive materials and products, using technologies things like modern methods of construction to make sure that we're reducing waste in those materials, and the emissions associated with the materials is reduced. But also for each of those materials, working with the supply chains of materials to maybe change their practices and their processes to reduce the emissions associated with the production processes for those materials. So on the next slide, again, like the other framework, we've outlined in the framework document what's our understanding of the current state and our vision, this time for 2050 rather than 25, you'll notice, for this framework. So currently, similar to the rest of the world, really, in New Zealand, there's a bit of a rudimentary, immature understanding of embodied carbon in buildings, and that's pretty much due to the next phase, which is really the next thing there, which is there is currently no regulations or incentives to either quantify embodied carbon or reduce embodied carbon. The focus to date has really primarily been on reducing, quite rightly, the environmental impact of operating buildings and making sure they operate efficiently. However, there is a growing interest in reducing the embodied emissions in buildings, both in New Zealand and around the world, really driven by an increasing scrutiny on the carbon emissions from buildings, from the materials and products, rather than just the operations. Because as we realise, as we squeeze the operational efficiency as much as we can, we realise that the relative significance of those embodied emissions associated with materials and products increases. So they become lower hanging fruit to get, essentially, to achieve reductions. So our vision for 2050 is that by then in New Zealand, we've got a really good understanding of embodied carbon in buildings. And that leads on to the significantly lower emissions from the production and use of construction materials and products than we have today. So that we see this being achieved by the efficient design of new buildings, but also using the tools that really enable us to account for and quantify embodied emissions, that they're widely used throughout the construction and building sector. What we really want to see is an increase in carbon literacy and making sure that, or trying to facilitate an environment where consideration of carbon is just as important as consideration of cost when we're designing new buildings, or indeed making any kind of decisions, not just designing, but constructing, demolishing, recycling, building products and materials. Next slide. So our approach to how we do this, how we're going to achieve this, moving from the current state to the vision. So the top line really there is that we want to make embodied carbon considerations mandatory for new building construction in New Zealand. And in order to, and we're going to do that first of all by requiring a reporting stage. So really just getting people into the practice of understanding the concepts, what's involved in it, getting used to the processes of reporting before bringing in caps as like the other framework that new buildings will have to meet a whole of life embodied carbon cap in order to get a consent to build. And by putting that requirement at that top level, the overall emissions, embodied carbon emissions for a building, we're really leaving the sector the freedom of choice to identify how best to reduce those embodied carbon emissions to come under that cap. Another advantage of the initial reporting stage is it gives the sector time to upskill, to really get used to the process, as we said, the tools and the data out there before the caps are introduced, and yeah, it'll become a requirement. And again, like the other framework, we're working with other government agencies that have large property portfolios and working with the plans that they already have, some of them already have in place in this area, really making sure that what they're programming in terms of their sustainable buildings or sustainable building procurement policies are aligned with this, and we can use this. We can use projects in the public sector to demonstrate to the sector as a whole how these new requirements can be complied with. The next slide. So the rest of the framework document covers some of these other key points as listed here, and there's numerous questions posed in the framework documents that we'd really like input on from you and anyone else in the sector about how you see us addressing these big issues that we know need to be addressed by bringing in these big changes. So when it comes to embodied carbon and the life cycle, whole of life embodied carbon, a really big point is methodology. How do you make sure that everyone's doing things the same way, making the same assumptions, including the same things, excluding the same things, so that you know you're being fair in comparing different assessments. So that's one thing. Where data is sourced from to make embodied carbon assessments, both on the embodied carbon coefficients, if you like. So for each type of material, what emissions we're accounting for each unit of a material, but then also how you're accounting for the quantities of materials going in the building as well. So big questions around data and how we include that in regulation. How different software packages and tools that are out there might be used or not used, and whether they can be compared across each other, or whether we have to stick to one, whether we should be designing our own. We're lucky in New Zealand, brands have done quite a lot of work in this area with LCA Quick, but there are, as we said, because there's a increasing interest in this area, there's quite a lot of tools out there that sort of do slightly different things. Some developed around the world that could be applied here. So there's big questions around how we make use of software and tools. The compliance process is another area that we're really keen to get feedback on and see how this might actually work, how BCAs can incorporate these requirements within the consenting process that we know already has its challenges. So that'll be a really important thing to focus on. And then there's the scope of what are we saying should be included in an embodied carbon analysis or embodied carbon assessment in the regulatory system. Should we cover all buildings? Should we may have a requirement for all different life cycle stages of a building? There are different places we can draw the line, and you'll see in the framework document, those of you who've read it, that we're proposing to limit the scope initially, but expand it over time, so that although initially we might be missing the regulation of some embodied carbon emissions for the sake of getting something through and getting it out there into the wider sector and getting a good uptake of this. We're proposing to try and make it simplified to start with at least, but then gradually expand it over time so that we are capturing the full scope of whole of life embodied carbon emissions in buildings. And I think that's the end of the summary of the framework. So we just want to finish with, yeah, that's fine. So the next slide. Just to recap on the upcoming, the next steps. As we said, the consultation open until Sunday, the 11th of October, I think 7 o'clock. So you can work on it over the weekend. Yeah, we can't emphasize enough how we're really, this is such an important time to really get everyone's voice heard in the sector. So really pleased to see NZGBC's submission already out there for draft, but anyone can make their own individual submissions, and do pass it around your contacts as well. Then, as we said, we'll be considering the feedback we've received through that process, releasing a summary of the submissions, and releasing details of our next steps. And as I said, it's the start of the conversation. There'll be many more conversations as we progress the detail of this that will take the form of future consultations. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled for that. So I think that's the end of the presentation. We'll open up for questions now. There were some questions on those slides, but never mind. Doesn't matter. In the back of the framework documents, there are some particular questions that we posed that we're really particularly interested in hearing feedback on, but you can give any kind of feedback you want. Here they are, yeah. And there's a link there to the survey. So it's there's multiple different ways you can give your feedback, but that's probably the easiest. Is just following that link to a SurveyMonkey questionnaire, which doesn't take long to.
Or if you just go on the MB site, you'll see there's a button on the front page to go to the Building for Climate Change program. You can download a Word document if you want to fill it out that way and email it back in, etc.
Yeah, we're very happy to take your questions now. And I think, Tom, are you going to field them to us?
Yeah. So it's great. So we've had a few questions coming through. So that's excellent. Thank you, everyone, and keep them coming through. So look, just to kick things off, I guess on the just on that that second framework, Katie, can you talk me through in terms of when you anticipate we're going to reach that point of industry literacy and introducing the first of the embodied carbon caps? Do you have an estimate of that time frame?
I don't think. I don't think you get to a point. I think it's a journey. You know, we'll always be learning on this, and I think when I first started looking at embodied carbon, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, there was a lot of response. People knew it was an issue. People knew we had to do something about it, but oh no, we couldn't do anything about it because there wasn't the data, and we didn't have the data. It wasn't robust enough. Now we're talking about, we need sort of robust frameworks, and there are still gaps in data as well, even today, and especially in New Zealand. It's really important to get local data when it comes to embodied carbon, and we're a small country, New Zealand, but I don't think that's an excuse not to start. And I don't have any preconceptions on timescales for bringing in caps. I mean, I don't want to influence people's responses to the consultations. The point. It really is a proper listening exercise. We do want to hear what people have got to say, and people put forward their good arguments for whether it should be sooner or later. But I mean, I guess we are in 2020. We've got a zero carbon target for 2050. It's not that long away. And we do want to reduce, we want to see these steps down in the caps. So, I mean, I guess that gives you an idea. If we haven't got a cap in, you know, I would say sort of 5 years, I think we'd be a bit worried. I'd be, but there you are. I've said a number now, having said I wouldn't.
Had a question through, are MB proposing creating their own energy tool, modelling method, or an existing tool? And is there a measurement of the built performance proposed?
So by measurement of the built performance, I'm assuming that means monitoring of energy performance once it's occupied. So there's two parts of that which are covered in the framework, probably very briefly, and that we have defined 2 building sizes effectively. So a building of 300 square metres, gross external and lower than 3 stories, or larger or taller than that. So for a small building, at the moment we're proposing that MB has an operational energy modelling tool, which would be available so everyone uses the same tool, and that would generate the report or the output that gets used for the consent application. Where it's a larger building above that size, then the proposal is at the moment that any industry tools which are currently being used would be acceptable for professionals to use, provided they meet certain requirements, and that MB would set out very clearly what the parameters for modelling being used would be. So we would have defined inputs that have to go into that modelling, but we wouldn't tell you what tool you have to use if you're talking about a large building. In terms of measurement of the building performance, there's various bits of work that we're doing around monitoring and things which relate to this particular program and what comes around. There's not any proposal in the framework at the moment that building owners and occupiers would need to report the energy use after they've occupied the building. It's an interesting point of discussion because, as I said, we weren't in the framework not looking at regulating people's behaviour so much as the way buildings are designed and constructed. Yeah, so if people have got particular thoughts around the monitoring side of things, I mean, our discussion has mostly been around whether commercial buildings need to have some kind of regular reporting and monitoring after they're occupied because of the nature of their occupancy rather than residential properties. But yeah, interesting to get people's thoughts when they respond to the consultation on that.
I'll also just chip in and say on the embodied carbon side, currently in our the proposals saying that for the smaller buildings, and we've kept the threshold across both frameworks the same, the 300 square metres, 3 stories. For those smaller buildings where we would anticipate sort of the building types and the forms of construction to be quite standardised, we'd have a simplified embodied carbon tool that might use default material quantities and default coefficients for carbon. Not to say you couldn't use other more complex tools if you wanted, even for those small buildings, but it would be an option. But for those larger buildings, we'd see a bit more, we want the added complexity to be reflected in a tool that had a bit more in it.
Right. Well, look, we've had quite a few questions around the behavioural considerations. And look, for those of you tuning in, we've had quite a few questions come through. So have a look through, and you can upvote the ones that you want answered as well. So that helps us just make sure that we get to those that everyone's interested in. It's just disappeared off. But in terms of the behavioural considerations as well, so there's one question here: divorcing building design from occupant use is likely to have unintended consequences and will be a lost opportunity. Keen to hear your thoughts on why good design shouldn't consider occupant behaviour. Surely best practice design must consider how buildings are used or lived in.
Yeah, I think maybe I wasn't clear on that before, in that the purpose of this framework and what we were going to regulate is not about educating people on how to behave better or use less energy or things like that, in the sense that the way we regulate design and construction buildings doesn't really cover that. So there are other programs of work within the Building for Climate Change program here at MB that will be looking at occupant behaviour. That said, the way that the regulations will work with the mandatory caps, or the way we are proposing it at the moment, would be accounting for occupant use and behaviour and what would be typically expected in the different types of building we're being considered. So the number of people in the building, the type of thing they're doing in the building, is all comes under part of the thermal performance and the energy use, etc., for that building. So it's not to say occupant use is not part of it, just that we're not talking about telling people how long they're allowed to have a hot shower for. We're talking about what the kind of fittings and the design of the system is going to be. And if you look at the evidence from where operational efficiency has been implemented in other places, once you get a really good base level of energy efficiency of buildings, if you survey across a whole lot of buildings and monitor the energy use, you'll still find that some people are absolute profligate users of energy and other people are absolute misers that use virtually no energy at all. But on average, the buildings are using what you expect to be in terms of the operational efficiency. So in terms of regulating how buildings are designed and built in New Zealand, what we want to get to is a place where all our buildings are on average reaching the kind of targets and the caps that we're expecting here to get the outcomes we want, not about each individual building being kind of pointing a finger at one person saying, oh, you're using too much energy, too much water. Hope that makes it a bit clearer.
Yeah, and I guess that leads on to the question of scope as well. I've had a question here about why exactly operational emissions from used buildings are not within the scope of these frameworks. Can you talk through a bit about the reasoning behind that?
Does that mean existing buildings, used buildings?
I'm guessing, yeah, existing buildings.
Well, when we kind of got the briefing for the Building for Climate Change program and looked at what we had to do, we had to kind of figure out what the scope of what we're going to do was going to be. And existing buildings and new buildings was one of the big debates about where we draw the line and how we do it. And at the moment, we currently regulate new buildings and how they're built and constructed. So it's something that we've already got regulatory levers and tools that we can put in place to make a change. Whereas existing buildings, actually, we don't have anything in place at the moment that would regulate and require people to make upgrades on their buildings. There is already some work on earthquake-prone buildings, and that's going through a bit of a teething stage about how that quite works in terms of requiring building owners to upgrade their buildings for earthquake requirements. And so we've been looking at how that works and seeing whether that's something that could equally be applied to the Building for Climate Change side of things. But it's there's a lot of challenges in there. And at the moment, we're just moving as fast as we can to start getting things happening. And so at this point in time, the focus is on new buildings, and existing buildings are not by any means forgotten or left behind, and are certainly on the agenda to be addressed at some point when we can.
Yeah, and I guess that leads on again to the idea of time frame for all of this as well. There's a question here. The Paris agreements refer to 2030, not 2035. So what are your thoughts on this delayed time frame? And I guess that more immediate goal and time frame, is that being factored into these frameworks and the timeline for them?
I'm going to, I don't know what you want to say, I'm going to kind of pass this one in a way to say that, like it was said before, the Zero Carbon Act, which came in last year, is what we've based everything on in terms of dates and the requirements for the national reduction, the emissions reduction plan, and how things relate to that. So that's what we've been working on. The dates kind of relate back to that.
So this is all, I mean, the whole point of this exercise of putting out these frameworks with proposals is to receive feedback like this. And, you know, one of the big questions that we're asking in this consultation process is about, you know, what's your view on the timelines that are proposed? So feedback like that is really, really, really valuable, because what is in these proposals is they are proposals. They're not. It's not set in stone. If there's really good reasons for changing that comes back in the consultation process, then we'll look very, very carefully at doing that.
And we've had a question about the pilot project. So how will you ensure there is no material bias in the public sector pilot projects? Will these projects take a long-term view? The question is, for example, or in effect, create a vision for what it could look like in 2050.
So yeah, we're taking about the sort of material bias. We're taking a material agnostic and indeed a whole sort of process agnostic standpoint, certainly in the embodied carbon framework, and that's really the value of setting that cap at that top level, and giving the sector the freedom to achieve reductions however they can, because every sector has got to play its part. So rather than kind of pumping for winners and saying this is we're pretty sure this is going to lead to a reduction, so we'll just shortcut it and and regulate for this, or provide incentive for this, we run the risk of not achieving the overall outcome that we want. So we're definitely very keen to maintain that material agnostic viewpoint across the frameworks, and so working with other government agencies in terms of their plans for their property portfolios, people like Kang Ora, Ministry of Education. We're working to try and make sure what they're planning is aligned with what we've got as well, and learning the lessons from what they're already doing at the moment to feed back into this, into our programme and the wider regulation of the wider sector.
And a question around the caps being whether they'll be industry specific, for example, office building versus hotel versus residential buildings. Will there be various caps depending on those sorts of specifications?
Operational.
Well, in terms of operational, at the moment we just put out a single cap that would apply across all types of buildings, and part of the way that is anticipated working is that a large part of the difference between different building typologies comes down to what's called plug loads in there, so not the thermal performance and not the fixed services. So we haven't I think we did set a cap on the plug loads for large buildings as well, but I think that's the sort of thing that this is very much the proposal at the moment, and we're really interested to get feedback from the industry, and we haven't collected a lot of data on what the kind of existing performance of buildings of different typologies in New Zealand is at the moment. So it's up for grabs that we could keep them the same, or we could have differences for different occupation, different building typologies, different occupancies. But yeah, this is a very first kind of go at this in terms of the proposal. So there's a lot more work to do on the detailed development of that side for the operational efficiency for sure. I don't know about embodied carbon, but.
There's a section in there in the framework about the different building classifications. At the moment, we're just proposing to address small and large buildings in a different way. But again, this is an area where we really welcome feedback. If there's good reasons for certain types of buildings to be if there's a need for them to be have a higher embodied carbon, perhaps they're higher performance requirements which require more of those high mass elements that tend to account for the bulk of embodied carbon emissions in a building, then by all means let's hear that. Really welcome feedback on that. I mean, in terms of I think with the embodied carbon framework, the initial reporting stage will inform a lot of our thinking on this. So we're really looking to use those that initial reporting stage to collect the data that is reported through that, and that'll show us where the big hitters are, if there's big discrepancies between different building types, if we need to refine a cap to adjust different building types, or some other kind of different differentiators between buildings. That'll that reporting stage will really inform that process.
Right, and I mean, I guess that data collection and that reporting may well feed into this, but we've had a question around a carbon budget. So is there a specific carbon budget you're targeting to achieve from the operational carbon emissions and the upfront embodied carbon measures?
So the emissions reduction plan, that's the whole of government response to the Zero Carbon Act and the carbon emissions budgets that the Climate Change Commission will be producing. That's the mechanism, if you like, where the 5 different sectors that are identified in that emissions reduction plan, it's their chance to kind of put forward what their current state is, what we think are achievable reductions across each of those sectors. And it may be that some sectors achieve much greater reductions than other sectors for less pain. You know, that's the whole reasoning behind that whole of government approach. So in terms of setting, quantitative budgets for the sector as a whole, that will come through the emissions reduction plan process, and the first draft of that is, I believe, out sort of the end of next year.
We didn't set a specific carbon budget in the proposals for operational efficiency at this point in time, and that's partly because, as it's described in the framework, the operational emissions is essentially a way of reporting all the subcategories below that. And of course, as the emissions factor of the electricity grid in New Zealand changes, then the overall emissions from the same energy use will change. So that's partly why it's also an efficiency framework rather than an emissions framework, because we're talking about how much energy is used in the building, and how much carbon comes out of that depends on what's happening in the electricity grid in New Zealand. And there's a lot of things at stake at the moment around that, which may change it quite dramatically. So yeah, we haven't set specific caps on that yet.
Right, I'm conscious we're running out of time, so it looks like we won't unfortunately be able to get to every question. But just finally, there's a question around offsetting. Are you considering allowing offsetting to get under those caps? Is that up for consideration at the moment?
We haven't mentioned offsetting in the frameworks yet, and I mean maybe on the embodied carbon side, because the initial stages will be about reporting, and that will inform the setting of the level at which the cap is set or are set. I know that there are proposals, I believe, in the Netherlands that they're setting embodied carbon caps or thresholds, and offering the option to offset if they're exceeded. My gut feeling is that we should be encouraging. We should be looking at ourselves as a sector and doing what we can, and really making sure that we're maximising our efforts and not sort of buying out from outside the sector. But that's a view that that's my sort of gut feeling view at the moment, if you like, without so if you've got other so feedback on that and the pros and cons of that that we could consider in the future would be very welcome. Thanks.
And similarly, there's no discussion around offsetting in the operational efficiency, and it's unlikely that it would be considered.
Excellent. Okay, well, unfortunately, we are out of time. So thank you both, and thank you everyone for your questions. We will be feeding those through to Elrond and Katie and the team there at MBIE. So just before we finish up, just to reiterate, submissions for this close 11th of October, 7 p.m. Is that correct?
I think so, yeah.
7 p.m. So head to the MBIE website for full details of the consultation and put through your submission. Just a quick note as well, just to mention that we here at the NZGBC, we've drafted our submission and it's available on our website for everyone to read. And so just head to nzgbc.org.nz and you'll see a link on our homepage. And we're actually welcoming feedback on that. So get in touch, and if aligns with your thinking, you're welcome to use it on your submissions as well. So thanks again. Thanks for joining us. Huge thanks to MB. Thank you, Elrond and Katie, for your time and expertise. All the best for the rest of the consultation process. For everyone listening, there will be a recording of this available shortly, so you can share that with your friends, family, your neighbours, anyone you want to, and be sure to check out our other World Green Building Week events we've got planned through the mid next week. So thank you everyone, get involved, stay safe, and we'll see you again soon. Ka kite anō.